Welcome to the Canadian Aviation Museum. My name is Dave Fluke. I'm involved with the education program, and I'm also one of the tour guides. And I'd like to relate one of my favorite stories about this place, and it's all about what I call the Second Battle of River Canard. Now, if you're familiar with Canadian history, in the War of 1812, the first Battle of River Canard took place at the bridge over River Canard, which was basically over Turkey Creek. And at that point, there were two drunken Canadian-British soldiers who held off a squad of Americans. And the Americans eventually, after they captured one, they took him back to Detroit, and they left the scene. Now, the second battle took place on November 21st, 1942, and it involved a young man here at the number 7 Elementary Flying Training School. His name was Lyle James. Now, Lyle was a pilot, and he was very close to finishing off his training. And on this particular day, he had to complete a low-level navigation flight and an instrument check. But the weather had been quite bad, and all other flying was basically scrubbed. And as long as Lyle was up with a second pilot and instructor, they allowed that exercise to happen. Now, a little bit of a background, some other things that you don't always hear about this story. There was a period where flying was quite busy, and the ground crew weren't getting fed. And somebody realized that the ground crew, being civilian, they better get some food to them. And when they did, the food was deemed as being bad, and it was rejected. So when the pilots came down from their extended flights, they tried to pass the food off onto them. And what happened is the food was discovered to be bad, was rejected, and it resulted in a food fight. Now, the food fight wasn't really a good thing to happen, and the commanding officer, he wasn't happy. So basically, the young airmen got confined to their barracks. All they could do was go to the classrooms, be in the link trainers, and be up in the air. So Lyle had one more thing to do. So on this particular day, he and his check pilot, or flying instructor, a man by the name of Al Bowden, they were instructed they had to leave Windsor, take off from Windsor, fly to Leamington on a triangular route from Leamington to Amherstburg and back to Windsor. And it was all to be done at very low level, looking at landmarks and compass readings. So Lyle and his second pilot, when they took off out of Windsor, Al Bowden kind of suggested to Lyle that maybe we should go have some fun. So instead of turning right and heading to Leamington, they turned left and eventually wound up going down the Detroit River. Also went down over top of Detroit, supposedly went under the Ambassador Bridge, and then they buzzed the Fort Dearborn plant out at River Rouge. The whole time they were looking for birds on the water or any animals, cows, that they could scare out. Everything done at low level. They eventually worked their way down to Monroe, Michigan, where they supposedly went right down the main street. And after that, they kind of realized that the Americans were going to come up and maybe shoot them down. So they immediately headed back to Windsor, and they made land over River Canard. And always looking for birds to scare or animals, they spotted some birds down on the water. So down they went. They were already at about 10 feet, and they went even lower. They flew right over the birds, and the birds didn't move. And when they pulled up, they felt a bump on the aircraft. So that puzzled them. They turned around, they came back, and the second time around, Lyle looked out and he saw a duck blind, or what was left of a duck blind. And at the same time, he saw flashes of light coming out of the guns of 3 hunters. And he realized that very shortly that light travels faster than birdshot. The aircraft was riddled. It had over 200 holes in it, and Lyle and Al both had wounds. Al had some facial wounds, and Lyle As he would say later on, most of his wounds were in his derriere. So now the problem is they had to come back to Windsor with a damaged aircraft, and they had to make up a story. So when they landed at Windsor, they immediately were questioned. And eventually, Lyle had to make a flight up towards Leamington, where they said in the story they made up that they had been shot at this certain spot along the shore of Lake Erie. When they got there in the flight, Lyle realized that where he was telling this story, it was all cottages and built-up areas. So he started to look around very quickly, and he found a small stream, and he pointed out that that's where he was shot from. Now, they had been directing a Mountie patrol to find that spot. So Lyle came back to Windsor, and he was immediately let go to his next assignment, which was a service flying training school, where he was to learn to fly on multi-engine aircraft. Meanwhile, the investigation, the OPP and the RCMP went out to that particular spot, and they found 2 shotgun shells. So end of story. Lyle went on to be a highly decorated bomber pilot, flew his whole career with 101 Squadron in the Royal Air Force. After the war, he came back to Canada and settled in Sarnia, Ontario. Shortly after he got back to Canada, he was summoned down to Windsor to face an inquiry. And when he came here, he was questioned about the story and its validity, and he stuck to his guns, pardon the pun, and only told what he had previously told. And then he faced an inquiry over in the States, and basically they told him not to do it again. Okay, they let him off. So Lyle went back to Sarnia. Meanwhile, the charges could have been quite serious, because damaging the king's property could have been a capital offense, and the 3 duck hunters, they could have been tried and possibly convicted of a capital crime. I'm sure that Lyle and Al Bowden decided not to say too much more about that, because they didn't want these young hunters to face any criminal charges. So Lyle, as we see here in the museum, he kept, or one of his friends in the ground crew gave him a trim tab from the aircraft, and it had over 20 small bullet holes or shotgun holes in it. And we have a picture here in the museum of that, as well as some artwork that depict the incident itself. So that is the story of the Second Battle of River Canard.